Hello everyone, I'm Susan Birch and welcome to another A Healthy New Zealand podcast. And my special guest today is Lyle McDonald. Anyone who's been around the fitness and nutrition industry for a while will know of Lyle. His work is about the most respected you can find out there. He's a trainer, researcher, and author of many books, including the Woman's Book, which provides a solution to female fat loss. He brings science into the real world for everyday people. When it comes to understanding the differences between body composition for men and women and the nuances in training and nutrition, Lyle is the go-to expert. Lyle, thanks for coming. Wonderful to have you. And I'll get you to just do a little intro of yourself and what you do.
So I think you pretty much covered it. I mean, I've been around since the internet started. I actually got on right about 1993 when it was sort of picking up, and I watched it both evolve and devolve. You know, it's brought a lot of good to the world, and it's brought some maybe not so much. In my career, my field, you know, I got very much into this through my own sporting interests. Is I was an athlete, and I was a good athlete, but I wanted to be better. And I went to UCLA to study physiology and got very involved in reading science back when you actually still had to go to the library. I remember those days, and sort of got lucky and turned what I was really doing, I think, to improve myself into a career. And I was really one of the first people, I think, in the fitness area to really push the science, to address the science. You know, until that point, it was just a lot of anecdote. In the weight room, they talk about, you know, refer to it as bro science, just what the bodybuilders and people had figured out. And I tried to bring science to that and wrote my first book on low carbohydrate diets in 1998. And now here we are, oh gosh, 23 years later. I think I've written 14 books, various topics, mostly focusing on nutrition, fat loss. I was one of the first people to write about sort of flexible eating principles and flexible dieting principles back in 2004, back before anybody was ready to hear it. Everybody knew that you had to diet at the extremes. And now, 17 years later, that's all anybody talks about. Other books like dietary proteins, some stuff for the general public, for leaner. And then my most recent book was on women's physiology. And it sort of spun out of another project. Like I'd been wanting to do something on that topic for years. And I think subconsciously I was avoiding it because I knew that it would be incredibly complex. Not to mention that I was very much starting from scratch, right? And I haven't run into it much, but there is often sort of a, you know, what does a man know about women's physiology? And the answer was at the beginning, absolutely nothing. And I'll be the first, like I have experience obliquely from partners, like I had seen it in the gym, I'd made observations, but I was starting, what's the terminology, from scratch. And what I thought would be a quick project took 3.5 years. And that was only for presumably volume 1. Like that was just for the nutrition stuff. The training stuff is a whole separate, to get into the details of it. So it was exhausting, but I don't mean that necessarily in a negative way. Like whenever I do a project like this about every 10 years, that makes me want to retire forever. And I just get into one of these modes. But I learned so much from it. Like it expanded, having to look into this, or choosing to look into it rather, expanded my knowledge base to just a whole nother level, because it was something and part of the complexity, and we'll get into some of this, like the deeper I went, the more I found. Like I could have kept going, but when you write, especially a book like this, eventually you just have to be done.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, at some point you have to just go, you know what? That I could have just kept everything, just branched into more and more and more details. But at some point you have to go, I have to stop here before this is 1,000 pages. It was only 400 for volume 1. So like I said, it's an area that there is stuff out there. Most of it is extremely technical. Like it's very much medical textbooks for physiologists, sports medicine, things of that nature. Or a lot of it is really just awful. A lot of the stuff that's aimed, and there is, sort of you're in your introduction, a lot of the ideas about dieting for women training for women, either A, comes predominantly from, what men do, right? Historically, women didn't really get heavily into sport till about the 60s or 70s. Right. In the US, it was really the late 70s. Prior to that, because of East Germany and Russia, women were starting to get into for Olympic medals, which means that for the majority of the 20th century, males were the largest number of athletes. Their coaches were male. And even now, sports science research is about 80% on men. So what happened is that women were just treated as smaller men. And it's true in medicine too. They're finding women are at differential risks for certain types of diseases compared to men. They respond to medical treatments differently. They needed to be, so there's all these areas, the assumption that you could just take the information on men and scale it down by 20% or whatever it was. To that, and this is especially true in the dieting subculture, traditionally women have been the ones who dieted. It's really only more recently that that's becoming sort of more common among men. And actually just because I find this an interesting bit of trivia, the one area of research that is reversed in terms of percentages, diet studies are about 80% on women. Because again, culturally, women are more likely to want to be dieting at any given time to want to lose weight. And some research finally asked, well, can we assume that diet research on women applies to men? They sort of reverse the question. And because a lot of it is behavioral, a lot of it is, there are differences. Again, I'm going to generalize. I know there's always exceptions, and realize if I'm qualifying things, I'm in the US, people are crazy about this stuff over here, so I have to be very careful with my language, possibly overly so for other places. And a lot of it, in general, women tend to prefer group dynamics, personal support. Men tend to be more competitive. So they've done a couple studies that looked at male-oriented weight loss programs. And one of them I remember very recently, they took the men and they divided them. They go, okay, based on your favorite soccer team. And they divided them into groups. And the deal was that rather than supporting one another, they were competing against each other. They were, every week, we're going to play a soccer game. And you can make points to beat the other team, or the more weight you lose. And they also refer to male-based humor, which I kind of assume are fart jokes, quite on. But anyway, but the point of this is being that is the one place and there are so many old bad ideas about weight loss for women. And I want to make sure to say this extremely politically. You remember, right? You're older, like I'm in my 50s, I'm 51 now. You remember the bad old days, right? My mom has told me stories, she's in her 70s now, about women at the Walgreens counter eating cottage cheese and lettuce. That's how you dieted.
Yeah.
There is a famous example. There was a Barbie doll in the 1960s. And you can go Google this online, or I could finally, and it's got a scale with it. And it's got a book. I'm a friend that says How to Lose Weight. And on the back, it says just don't eat. Horrible. But you still see so much of that. You still see that, well, if you're a woman and you want to diet, what do? You eat as little as you can. And you either don't exercise, you exercise as much as you can. You see that other extreme. And it can cause a tremendous number of problems, both psychologically, behaviorally, physiologically, in terms of menstrual. So there's all these old ideas that comes out of that, especially in the dieting realm. A lot of the training ideas are coming from male-oriented literature. Now, I don't want anybody listening to this. The generalities are always going to hold, right? If your goal is fat or weight loss, yes. Do you have to create a deficit with diet? Sure. Do you have to actually? Yes. It's a matter of the specific application, because women have issues that men simply won't face. And they're finding that, especially, again, I know I tend to kind of jump around, just kind of very long introduction. As women entered sports, all the doctors of the day, mostly men, let's just face facts, were like, oh, too fragile, their ovaries will fall out, it'll turn them into men. They were just and even coming into the 80s and 90s, they were like, oh, one when women started, was it ski jumping or something? And he was like, look, every time a woman does this, it's gonna loosen her uterus. It's like just, on the one hand, you look at that and go, this is ridiculous. But there is an element of truth to it, and that we know that women can get reproductive, they can lose their menstrual cycle, they can have menstrual cycle dysfunction. Women are more likely to experience catastrophic ACL injuries than men, and for different reasons. They are more prone to concussions and more likely to have a negative outcome from them. So now none of which is to say that women shouldn't do sport. What it is to say is that we need to take these things into consideration. We need to do the proper training to make sure women's knees, that they have that training to avoid these, career-ending knee injuries. So it's more that the savants of the day their reasoning was wrong, but some of their ideas were right in the sense women are at greater risk. But it's also women, especially in the US, I don't know what the situation is elsewhere. At the high school level, traditionally, all boys play sports, all boys are introduced to the weight room. Women generally are not, or traditionally have not been. Things are changing, but even so. So you have female athletes, they reach the collegiate level. The boys have been weight training for 5 or 6 years. The women haven't. They reach higher levels of competition. They don't have the fundamental training that they should have gotten to prepare them, and they get hurt and their careers are over. They're not getting the proper training that they need to address. So the fundamentals will always apply. It's a matter of the application. Mm-hmm. The other big issue, and I think, and this kind of segs into what we actually want to talk about, is differences in hormonal environment. Right? So if we go back, prior to puberty, little boys and little girls about the same. I mean, there's subtle physiological differences, but body composition, performance is about the same. Then at puberty, that's when things diverge. Men will gain muscle and lose body fat and get broader shoulders. Women will typically, gain breast tissue, hips and thighs. Their pelvis may widen, gain body fat. And this is hormonal. This is also when you see the performance differences occur. Women on average, about 10% below men's performances. It depends on the sport, from like 7 to 20, depending on, but on average about 10%. And that's because they typically carry 10% more body fat and 10% less muscle. And this is being driven hormonally at puberty. All right, so what is a man's primary hormone? Is testosterone. Now, if we were to look at men's testosterone over a month, this is what it looks like. It's a flat line. Okay, it's not exactly it. It shows, minor variations throughout the year. And obviously, as men get older, it goes down a little bit. But by and large, on any given day, a male athlete or a male trainee is basically the same. Yeah. Essentially. Mm-hmm. Whereas a woman's hormones are changing significantly every 2 weeks at least. And then there are smaller changes within the week. And I'm talking, obviously, referring to the standard menstrual cycle, which is kind of what I want to get into next. So the menstrual cycle, we typically treat as 28 days. And I'm gonna say it's 28 days for convenience. It's really not. Anywhere between 25 and 32 days is considered normal. Women actually, apparently, when they're polled, will say it's 28 days, even though it's generally not. Some women are like machines. Some women, 28 days or 27. Some women, it'll vary month to month. They'll have a longer and then a shorter. When women hit puberty, it's a little less stable. As women get older, it becomes a little bit more stable. So let me sketch out the menstrual cycle, which, like I said, I'm going to treat it as 28 days just because that's a month, just 4 7-day weeks. Day 1, by convention, is the first day of bleeding, first day of menstruation. The first 2 weeks are called the follicular cycle. Right? This is when the follicle containing the egg develops, right? Hence follicular. Day 14, right at the midpoint, ovulation. That's when the follicle bursts, releases the egg. That's ovulation. What's left of the follicle develops into what's called the corpus luteum, and this weeks 3 and 4 are called the luteal phase, right? Corpus luteum. So 2 big 2-week blocks. In the first half of the cycle, the follicular phase, Estrogen, one of women's primary reproductive hormones, starts very low. It hits a peak about 3 days before ovulation, before crashing back down. Progesterone, the other primary hormone in women, stays very low all the way through the first 2 weeks. Right, so ovulation hits. Estrogen, which has fallen, will come back up to about half the level it hit in week 2.
Yeah.
Progesterone will go from being very low. It's now being produced by the corpus luteum. It will go up significantly, and it's about twice as high as estrogen. So in week 3, this is progesterone, this is estrogen. They'll both come up, and then they'll go back down in week 4. And week 4 is typically when, if a woman is going to suffer from premenstrual syndrome or premenstrual tension, depending on what different. I know some UK, British premenstrual tension, typically going to be in week 4. Yeah, your words, not, like I said, I'm gonna be real careful with my language here, but right, that's typical. Even then, women show huge variation. Some women will have a couple days in week 3, and then some women will experience premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is the extreme version, where they can be incapacitated by cramps, depression, suicidal ideation, right? And there's variation. Some women in week 4 will have nothing. Some women in week 4 will have some, and there's a ton of different things that can occur: cramping, pain, loss of coordination, emotional instability. That's what I'm going to refer to it as, so I don't get into trouble. Some women will lose their words, because estrogen is very important for brain function. Like, they just lose their vocabulary. Did a consult with someone recently, and she's just like, yeah, week 4, I go dumb. She's like, I don't know, like, I just dumb. And I'm like, and this is all due to low estrogen is a big part of it. And some women will experience nothing. And so it just varies. And then menstruation starts, and we start all over again. And from the time she hits puberty, which can be, I think, on average about age 13 now, to later in life, where she starts the menopausal transition, that's basically going to occur monthly. And actually, and that's another issue to consider, is, like I said, men's hormones stay the same and goes a little bit down with age over time. As women enter the menopausal transition, which has an early perimenopause, which means near menopause, a late perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause, everything changes again. Because now she goes from this menstrual cycle to producing little to no estrogen and no progesterone. We haven't even talked about polycystic ovary syndrome, which is the most common, and we could do an entire podcast on this, and I'm happy to, because it's so important. It is the most common reproductive
maybe we could
function in women.
Because I see a lot of women with PCOS, so that might be a really good thing to do.
Like, that can be a whole separate thing, because that changes the system. It can lose their menstrual cycle dysfunction, and then you've got birth control, which adds. Birth control is so unbearably complicated. When I was writing the book, I nearly had a nervous breakdown trying to wrap my head around it, because it's so complex. So I'm just going to focus on the menstrual cycle. I consider it sort of the base of women's physiology in terms of hormones. So again, sketching it out: 28 days, ovulation in the middle. First 2 weeks, estrogen starts low, spikes up, comes down, comes back up and back down. Progesterone, low through the first 2 weeks, comes up into week 3, drops back in week 4. I would note there's also a small spike in testosterone right at ovulation. I suspect this is actually to promote sex drive, because there's a lot of changes that occur, basically because that's when women are fertile, and that's kind of what this is all aimed at for women. So estrogen tends to get the blame for a lot of things in women, but it's actually, I hate to use the words good and bad when referring to hormones. Obviously, every hormone in the body has important functions. But if we're talking about body fat, dieting, fat loss, estrogen is mainly a good hormone. So things estrogen does: improves insulin sensitivity, so women's bodies tolerate carbohydrates better in the first 2 weeks. Decreases inflammation, increases muscular remodeling, very important for women in terms of building muscle. Tends to actually promote fat oxidation in skeletal muscle, controls appetite, that big spike in estrogen right before ovulation. It's typically when women will be the least hungry for food and alcohol. And just because I think it's a funny bit of trivia, one researcher suggested, and there's actually data to support this, that the reason estrogen blocks women's appetites for food and drink is so that she will have greater appetites for, shall we say, other pleasures. Because again, and this all makes logical sense in an evolutionary sense. And they've actually done research on this, that for women, the lower their food appetite, the higher their sexual appetites, and vice versa. So there's a lot of logic to this. So estrogen, by and large, the good hormone in terms of what we're talking about. Progesterone does two things. It's basically the bad hormone in this regards. In that not only does it have direct effects, it causes insulin resistance. So women's bodies don't handle carbohydrates well in weeks 3 and 4. They often get very fluctuating blood sugar, which can drive appetite. And also appetite goes up a little bit week 3 and 4. Cravings, it's hard to tell with women. Is it falling estrogen? Is it increasing progesterone? Is it the ratio? Women are really hard to study for this reason. Figuring out what's causing what when you've got two hormones that are overlapping and varying, it gets really complicated. Progesterone tends to directly stimulate fat storage in lower body fat cells, increases protein breakdown, which tends to be not by huge amounts, but the effect is there. So not only does it have these direct effects, but it also blocks estrogen's effects. So it's kind of a double whammy. And again, in evolutionary, if you think about this, right, the goal of the menstrual cycle is geared towards pregnancy. So the whole thing with fat storage, with increased appetite, with increased cravings in weeks 3 and 4, is so that if a woman gets pregnant, she has the calories to support pregnancy, right? Now, when I mention this to women, they'll go, but I don't want to get pregnant. I go, well, your body doesn't either know nor care, right? It doesn't care what you want to do. This developed over however many years to be aimed at the survival of the species. So that's the basic cycle. So, and I tend to use this as kind of a base, like when if we have time, we can talk a little bit about what happens at menopause. When estrogen drops, nothing good happens in terms of women's physiology. But then we can add to that hormone replacement, which is this whole. So part of the reason women are so complicated is, what is that? 1, 2. There's like 6 different potential hormonal profiles, right? Menstrual cycle dysfunction, PCOS, all 5 or 6 types of birth control, the variations prior to menopause, the variations after menopause. Did a woman go on hormone replacement or not? Now they're not all completely different, but they're different enough that they have specific considerations. So, and part of the reason the women's book was so exhausting is me being me. I wanted to cover all of them. With men, you've got to cover one situation. And that's why people have asked me, well, when's the men's book coming out? They've already been written. There's 1,000 of them out there, because you don't have to worry about any of this.
Yeah, just
and this will sound like pandering, but it's true. Men are simple from top to bottom. And I mean, and I say that as a man, men tend to have sort of very simple drives, and we're simple physiologically, and it's a pretty simple system. And women are complex in a way that men simply are not, from top to bottom. So anyway, so that's kind of the overall pattern. And so you can sort of see that there can be variations in things like appetite control, how a woman's body utilizes nutrients changes. And like, it's not whole scale, but there are variations. So her appetite will be best controlled in weeks 1 and 2. That's a good time. If a woman's going to start a diet, that's when it should be, because that's when she's most likely to get 2 weeks of, and this is something I found it mentioned in a paper, and I don't think I've ever seen anyone actually talk about this but me. When is the best time for a woman to start a new diet or a new fat loss program? It's in weeks 1 and 2 of the cycle. Because if you started, I'm not saying it can't be done in weeks 3 and 4, but you're fighting an uphill battle. That's when cravings occur. That's when appetite increases. Can it be done? Sure, but you're less likely to have a good time. There's even data that I haven't really delved into. Women who are trying to quit smoking or stop using drugs, when they do it in their cycle, alters their likelihood of success, because we are dealing with not only changing hormones, but those hormones are altering a woman's brain chemistry. So this is all sort of tied in together. So that we've got that variable. Like I said, some women, again, during week 4, PMS week, may not be able to get out of bed at the extremes. There can be cramping, there can be pain, there can be a loss of coordination. Some women see big performance variations in their training week to week to week, others don't. But something you mentioned, we will come back to this, right? We are in sort of a culture of, when it comes to training, harder is better. CrossFit, if you're not walking out of the gym exhausted all the time, you're not doing it right, which I don't care for as a philosophy in general. But you run into women that are very dedicated to their training, and I would never say that's a bad thing. But if in week 4 their coordination is shot, their energy is bad, their mood is worsened, and they will have this idea that I can just power through it, I can just will myself through it. It's like, but there's a biology underlying this. Now, some have co-opted this, again, especially in the US, of, PMS doesn't exist, PMS is made up, PMS was created by the patriarchy too, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, no, there's a biology. Or, the women just use it as an excuse to be, a certain way. It's like, yeah, I can see that perspective, but there is an underlying biology to it that you can't ignore. Right? As estrogen and progesterone go down, serotonin goes down. So if you're prone to depression, that will tend to occur. Dopamine goes down, which tends to be involved in motivation, in drive, and appetite in the reward center. There is a biology to it. And that's something that's just often not, because again, with a guy, I know who's walking to the gym every day. The same dude I trained 2 days ago. I talked about this with a therapist and a nurse practitioner I know. The nurse practitioner says, look, we often have to put in an antidepressant for some women in week 4 and week 4 alone, because their normal medication is for that week, because they will become suicidal. My therapist put it a little bit more snarkily, and he goes, with men, I always know who I'm treating. With women, I won't know till about 10 minutes in who I'm. Because if she comes in and all of a sudden 5 minutes in, she's bawling her eyes out over something well, that's who I'm treating. No, he wasn't saying it as a negative. I'm not either. I'm not trying to be like, women, that nonsense. It is simply something that needs to be taken into consideration that frequently isn't with training programs. Because again, they're aimed at men, and men are the same every day.
So what kind of advice do you have for women then? I mean, I think you touched on it, that they'll be hungrier and probably not so well coordinated, not able to lift better in the gym. What about endurance performance? Does that get affected as well?
It can a little bit. And so if you look at the research, a lot of it says, there's no real difference in women's performance across the menstrual cycle. And a lot of that was done in endurance training. Also, they tend to average it, right? If I take 30 women and 10 have their performance go terribly and 10 improve and 10 show no difference, well, the average is 0, but that ignores the individual response. Also, with endurance training, I was an endurance athlete for years. Endurance training tends to be done much more submaximally. So even when you're tired, you can always put in the time. Like what you do see, because like I said, in weeks 3 and 4, women become more insulin resistant. They don't utilize carbohydrates as well. So they utilize more fat for fuel, which is good for longer duration endurance. But when they've done research and had women do like all out time trials, like go as hard as you can for an hour, that performance is decreased because that type of performance requires carbohydrates. And when women are in, so there can be, even in the weight room, like bodybuilding training, which tends to be a little bit more submaximal, not as big of a deal. And the way so like, let's say this is your 100%. Right? If you're training at 75% and your best is down a little bit, 5 or 10%, you can probably still do the workout. It'll be harder. Whereas if you're, say, a power lifter, an Olympic lifter working, and you're supposed to be working at 90% of your maximum, and suddenly your maximum if it's come down to 90, well, what should be 90% is now all out. If you get hit hard and it comes down to 85%, That workout is now impossible. Right. So I had a trainee years ago when this was, again, I was just being a dumb boy. And she would, 1 week out of every 4, she'd go in and she's like, I can't lift this weight. And be like, what do you mean? Lift the weight. She's like, I can't. I'm like, what do you mean? Lift the weight. But I started paying more attention. I realized, okay, this is very systematic. This is very organized. This is week 4. Her coordination would go out the window. Her strength would absolutely crater. She couldn't, it was almost like her dopamine levels, I think, were so low. It's almost like pseudo-Parkinson. She literally couldn't initiate certain lifts. So when I finally got my head out of my rear end and realized this pattern, I was like, okay, rather than trying to force you into the training, I'm going to adapt the training to you. So, and what I would notice is as soon as she'd start menstruating, boom, she would be ready to just pop off personal bests and hit big numbers. So I'm like, okay, week 1, that's your heavy week, because that's when you're going to be ready to kill it. Week 2 should be a little bit down, so I'd cut it 5%. After week 3, she'd be up about a little. Like week 4, we're going to go goof off, not goof off, but I'm like, I would put her on machines, low coordination. 60, we would do higher repetitions. We would just go get some movement in, just put some time in. So I would keep her, so she got to work out, she got to exercise, but I wasn't expecting something of her that biologically, physiologically, she was not going to be capable of doing, because that's not, and like I said, but when she was ready to go, I would let her go. And she would, a day out, one day I actually saw for a while her working out twice a day. She'd work out in the morning, work out in the afternoon. We did this for a while. And one day we came in, and right before her morning workout, terrible, just looked terrible. And she started bleeding at lunch. And that afternoon, she hit a personal best in one of her lifts. And I've talked to other coaches, a coach I did a consult with. And it's like, I had an athlete in a week out from a big competition. She just looked terrible. And then 4 or 5 days out, she started her period, and boom, right as rain. So again, not everyone will experience that. Some women, it will not, or it may be much smaller. And I would say if there's a generality, and apparently the Soviets used to do this, week 1 after menstruation seems to be the best week on average. Some women, if cramping is really bad, if bleeding is really heavy, first couple of days, they may not be ready to, really go blow it out of the water. And then week 2, they bring it down a little bit. Week 3, that little spike of testosterone probably helps a little bit. And then week 4, they would give them an easy week, right? And that's a common way of training athletes. You do 3 harder weeks and then 1 where you deload. Well, let's just schedule that. If week 4 is going to be a throwaway week, put that in the plan. And what I would recommend to women listening to this, right, because I can speak in generalities, I can speak in averages. Every woman will be different in this regards. And I dare say this is another place women show more individuality than men. Are there differences in men and how? Yeah, absolutely, but less so. So what I would recommend to women is for a month is that you'll be your own best scientist. Or if you have a coach, they will, they can help with this, is that just plan for a month to do the same workout every week, right? Whatever you're doing in your training, whether it's endurance, weight training, whatever it is, just do the same workout every 4 weeks and record things like motivation, energy, rating of perceived exertion. Hell, even if you could or couldn't complete the sets or the workout, record that to see what your individual pattern is. And you may see it's flat line. You may see that it's great, down, okay, and oh my God. Once you have that data, then you can start adjusting. And you may simply have to accept, if your woman is just like, I gotta go hard, I gotta kill myself every day. If in week 4, it's not there, no matter what you do, well, you just have to accept it. Go do something else. Go do different types of training. If you always do cleans, go do kettlebells. Go do something with less. Go do something that you can still enjoy and push. That's not, a maximal snatches to failure or whatever CrossFit's doing now. I don't want to get too. I'm not a big fan because I think it hurts a lot of people. Because again, they're just like go out all out every day, no matter how you feel, and that's not a good way to train. And again, you can there's a concept in training called auto-regulation, where you sort of go by feel. It's like, all right, if you go into the gym and feel good, go hard. And if you feel terrible, take it easy. The problem in my experience, driven athletes will never admit they don't feel good.
Mm-hmm.
As a coach, the worst question I can ask an athlete is, do you want to do more? Because the answer is always yes, always. The question is, do you think you should do more? And then they lie.
They'll say yes.
Right. And same thing. I did it to my coach too. An athlete comes in and I go, how do you feel? Oh, coach, I feel great. I'm ready and raring to go. And then I watch them warm up and go, you look like dog poo. Like your coordination's not there, your explosion's not there. So you ask them that and then they lie to you. Just, it's part of being an athlete. I did it to my coach too. It is what it is, because athletes don't want to take easy days, even if that's what they need. So auto-regulation can work if you're very honest with yourself. Most trainees, in my experience, not a good coach can do that. If I'm watching my athlete, I've trained a very high-level powerlifter, and I have a plan and I know what she wants to do, which is she always wants to beat her previous best. And I go, well, if you've got it, I'll let you do it. Like, I'll let you, if the workout unfolds that way, I'll let you run. But if you're not there, I'm not going to give you something that's going to make you fail, because I don't want that in your. So anyway, so women fundamentally have to be their own best. And it may depend on the type of training. It's bodybuilding in higher rep ranges with a little bit less intensity may not be so bad. When you're working closer to that maximum, for women who do a lot of interval training, you may find that you just can't hit the power outputs. You just can't put out the intensity because your maximum is down. And that maybe you just program some easier days. There's actually one of the earliest books I ever saw about this was I want to say Australian, but could be New Zealand, was actually two female sports scientists who wrote one of these, like in the early 90s, wrote a book about women's issues in training. And they had this whole scheme with week 1, you focus on this, and week 2, you focus on that. And, like I said, when you're week 3, when you're probably not going to be able to do high intensity endurance training, if you're an endurance athlete, you're going to use a lot of fat for fuel. That's a good time to just maybe go grind some miles, put in that base training, and then go a little bit easier on week 4 to recover. And then week 1 and 2, when you're ready to really blow it out of the water, and your physiology is cooking, that's when you do your developmental interval work. There is even some work, and sorry for talking over you before I forget this thought, that has looked at women's response to clustering training in either week 1 or 2 or week 3 and 4. So what they did is they had them do 12 workouts, and one group did 10 in the first 2 weeks, and then 2 in 1 in week 3 and 1 in week 4.
Right.
Or they flipped it. They did 1 in week 1, 1 in week 2, and then 5 in week 3 and 5 in week 4.
Mm-hmm.
And then one third study actually did 3, 3, 3, 3, did like the third comparison group. And what was found is that clustering training into the first 2 weeks, the follicular phase, generated something like 30% better gains in strength and muscle mass than clustering it into weeks 3 and 4 in the luteal phase. And it even was better than doing the 12 workouts spaced out. Because like I said, estrogen decreases inflammation, critically important in remodeling of muscle tissue. So there may be some logic to approaching training that way, of doing, like I said, like I just said, proportionally more of your sort of quality work of your heavier training. And week 3 is usually not as bad in my experience, but maybe focus on, more, whether it's technical work, if you're a weight room athlete or an Olympic lifter or a power lifter. And I'm not saying that the women didn't get any gains in weeks 3 and 4, but it was decreased. Mm. So there may be some benefit to that, or just doing different. And then again, week 4, usually if women are going to have a bad week, it's probably that one. As the greatest generality I can give. So these are all considerations that but again, women establish your own pattern.
And I was just going to say, it's probably reassuring for women, but even for men, any men that might be listening to this, because one of the things I hear all the time, more from the general population, is I'm performing like crap, so therefore I need to train harder. I'm not training harder, you know? And so I think, you know, I'll let you comment on that.
No, that's absolutely true. And I mean, when I was an athlete, I did the same thing. When your performance is going down, you tell yourself to train harder, and that's usually the exact wrong thing to do. It's your body telling you to back off, to recover. And they sort of determined sort of years ago what's going on is, you know, like when you get the flu, what do? We sleep, we rest our body, we get this lack of motivation, appetite might shut down, we're exhausted. And when we're sick, we listen to that. Well, it turns out that when you start to get, we're training too hard, too much, too often, you get into such a chronic state of inflammation in the muscles that they send the same signals to the brain, like when you have the flu, that are saying, rest, we're dying here. But for some reason, we'll rest when we're sick. But athletes, nope, and they push harder. And this actually sort of brings me back to the women and dieting thing, because women do it, men do it too. I hate to generalize, but I see it more commonly in women, probably because women are more likely to diet. So let me put a pin in that. One other thing I want to mention with regards to menstrual cycle dynamics that's very important for female dieters has to do with changes in water weight. Because again, men's body weight, men's hormones, flat line. Like, yeah, do men go up and down with water and food in the tummy and, you know, yeah, but women can show very systematic changes in body weight due to shifts in water weight. And typically what you see is typically the first week of the cycle, body weight will be the lowest, like by day or 2 or 3, thereabouts. Right before ovulation, that spike in estrogen causes women's bodies to hold on to sodium more. So if she's on a high sodium diet, she may retain some water. Now, I can't say how much. Again, every woman is different. Every woman will have their own pattern. You know, her body weight may be up. Let's just say it's 1 kilo, just to throw a value out. Right? Then it'll typically come back down in week 3. One good thing progesterone does, it is a diuretic hormone. It makes clears up women's skin because it blocks testosterone, et cetera, et cetera. So body weight typically goes back down. And as any woman listening to this probably knows, if there's going to be a week where water weight spikes and, you know, you get swelling, we over here, we call them cankles. I don't know if other countries call, you know, where you get severe swelling in the legs and especially in the calves, and your rings don't fit and you feel waterlogged. It's going to be week 4. And that's because in this case, the falling progesterone levels cause a rebound and women's bodies hold sodium again. So the same thing happens for different reasons right before ovulation and right before and during PMS week. And then as everything kind of resets at menstruation, the water weight drops off. So imagine you're a woman who's dieting, right? You start in you go, all right, I'm going to start week 1, day 1, going to do it right. Everything's chugging along. And suddenly going into week 2, you're up 1 kilo. What the hell? Right?
Train harder, eat less. You know?
I'm doing right. I'm doing the right thing. What's going on? And then week 3, your body weight drops by some amount. All right, back on track. And then you go into week 4 and you're up by 2 kilos.
Yeah.
And that's when you throw your hands up and go, forget it.
Yeah.
I quit. I'm doing it because what we're dealing with is these water weight shifts. And body weight, as I'm sure your listeners know, right? Body fat and body composition is more relevant than body weight. Body weight still is not, I don't think is as worthless as some are making it out to be, but it has to be used with caution. And again, for women, more so than men.
I'll get you to talk a bit about the importance of thinking about body composition, though, because I think that's still quite misunderstood.
Very much so.
Actually, I might throw a couple of questions out to you and then you can probably weave them into your answers how you want. So body composition, the different places that women and men store fat, you know, so that propensity, maybe a little bit about why that hip and thigh fat is more stubborn and why it's more difficult for women to lose. And then I also kind of energy availability, about, you know, because everyone's about calories in, calories out, but what about the calories you need for that other stuff that you've got to do? And I'll let you just then kind of take that where you want to go.
Let me come back to that. I want to finish I had two thoughts and I'll get to that. So what I was going to say about tracking body weight is women cannot, if they're using body weight as a measurement, and it still can be a valid one if you do it correctly. And by that, I mean, you should weigh daily, put it in one of those apps that gives you that averages out the number, is you can't compare week 1 to week 2 or week 2 to week 3 because water weight changes. We'll throw that off completely. It'll make the values meaningless. What women have to do is almost wait a month to track their changes, because what you have to do is compare week 1 to the next week 1, week 2 to week 2, week 3 to week 3, and honestly, stay off the scale week 4. Nothing good will come of it. Honestly. Although even here, women can get this same data before they start dieting, before they start doing anything else. Just track your weight and see what your individual changes are. Some women get very little. Some women can hold a tremendous amount of water, just to see what your normal, maybe here and up a kilo and down half a kilo and then up 2.5 kilos, like to get your own pattern. Because let's say what you might see, and I'm just going to use round numbers because they're easier for my brain. Let's say you weigh 80 kilos in week 1. Again, metric is hard enough for me without doing complex math, right? So let's say you lose a kilo, right? So you should be down at 79. But week 2, you go up to 81 because of that water weight. That's that 1 kilo weight gain, right? And then in week 3, you come down to, let's say 80.5. I've already made this hard on myself. Don't worry about it. And then in week 4, you go up to 83, right? Yeah. So 80, 81, 80.5, 83. That's so a month goes by. Let's say you've lost a real kilo of body fat. What you might expect to see is 80 becomes 79. 81 becomes 80, right? It's the same kilo. It's just from a different level. 81.5 becomes 80.5. So week 4, bit of a crapshoot, but in theory, 83 should become 82. Mm-hmm. So you're seeing that same kilo tracking through the month. It's just tracking from the individual, and then next week, hopefully, or next month, 79 becomes 78, 80 becomes 79, 80.5 becomes. So you have to and it can be frustrating because frequently you're like, all right, I got to wait a month. After the first month, you can sort of track week to week. You can see what's going on, but it does make things more complicated. All right. What I was going to say about that, this ties into the training and dieting too hard thing, is one thing I've seen women do. Again, men do it too, but women are told so many terrible things about how to diet. Is they're dieting, weight loss stalls. And that could be for a number of reasons. Sometimes it's food misreporting. There's often a generalized water retention, especially with chronic stress. And one thing I'm of the belief of is I think compared to even say 10, 20, 30 years ago, women are being exposed to more lifetime stress than at any time in history, because we've now reached a point where women either choose to or have to or expected to work full-time job. And sometimes that's just because cost of living is so high, to still take care of the household, take care of children if they exist, take care of the big child, aka the husband, then fit their own training and it's a lot of stress, and chronic stress often will cause water retention. So things stall. She's already training hard. She's dieting hard. And what does her brain do? Well, if I've stalled, I need to eat less and train more. When frequently the best thing is to back off and take a few days off, raise your calories, something I've written about for a lot of years, and this will tie in the energy availability stuff very much so. Sometimes I've seen women, and listeners will probably relate to this, you might too, is they're dieting, they've been stalled for 3 weeks, and they go, you know what? Screw it. I'm going to take a couple of days off and I'm going to go get drunk or whatever I want, go eat a bunch of food, and then wake up 2 days later and they're down 2 kilos. They look better, because the water weight drops off because they've released that stress. And then in my experience, they go right back to dieting too hard. Separate issue. But what happens, or what can happen, is there's this really ugly cycle, just like in athletes. You're training, your performance is going down, you do more, your performance keeps going down, you do more until you finally just explode. You get injured, you get burnt out, you get overtrained, you lose all motivation. It can take weeks or months to drag out of that. The same thing can happen with dieting, where women just get into this cycle of stall due to stress, which can be low calories and excessive training. Well, I got to do more. Cut calories, train harder, stall harder, hold more water, cut calories further, train harder, and they blow up. And at the extremes, this can cause permanent issues. Not so much in reproductive stuff, which I'll come to, but you can get situations where the stress system basically shuts down. And it's not adrenal fatigue, and I don't want to get into that, but it's involved. Basically, when you overdrive the stress system too hard for too long, it shuts down to protect the body, and you can end up in a very, very bad place that I've never seen any good treatment for. So frequently, the best thing you can do is just ease off for a few days.
Can I ask a question? I hope that the person who contacted me about this might be listening to this. I've had a lady contact me a couple of times. She goes to a gym. She trains really, really, really hard, and they do DEXA scanning. And they keep doing these challenges all the time, and her calorie intake is getting lower and lower. Her protein intake is really low, and she's quite concerned about eating more protein. And with DEXA scanning, what she's finding is she's losing muscle and her visceral fat gain is increasing. So, sorry, I'm interrupting your flow, but I just thought it might be time to sort of
but it sort of makes the point. Like, this is the exact opposite of what should be happening. And do you know, like, does she still have a menstrual cycle? Does she still?
She does. She's on anti-anxiety meds as well. So,
you can, and chronically elevated cortisol, like the hormone cortisol's gotten kind of the bad rap, and like, again, no hormone in the body is good or bad. Pulses of cortisol, very healthy, very beneficial. Chronically elevated cortisol that you see, A, with excessively low calories, B, with chronically exhaustive training. And some people just are more stressed. And the fact that she's on anti-anxiety drugs, she just has probably a little bit more of a stress response. And even there, women respond to stress differently than men, which is a whole separate issue in terms of how their stress response, what they have stress responses to. But some people are just wound tighter than others. And I used to see it years ago when I thought I knew a few things, and I know a few things more now. You can always tell online when people are a little bit like that, because they type in all caps and exclamation points, and it's always like, I must lose weight now. Like, you can hear the tension in their typing. And one research group, and this will Tiny Energy Available, has even they believe that the loss of menstrual cycle is due to psychological stress, because in a very real way, the body cannot differentiate physical stress and psychological stress. And they also refer to dieting. It's a psychodynamic stress, right? Dieting is a stress. Wanting to lose fat is a psychological stress. We then impose so much more of it on us. When you're always doing boot camps and challenges and always under eating, but chronically elevated cortisol it breaks down some tissues in the body, including muscle. It's her bone mineral density at least being maintained. Is she losing bone mineral density? I'd be very concerned with that.
Yeah, she has.
The DEXA should pick that up, but chronically elevated cortisol can cause visceral fat accumulation. So she's almost getting, like, I also would suspect she may not have lost her menstrual cycle yet, but there can be sort of, there's a process, there's like stages women go through. I suspect that's not far off. As estrogen helps prevent against visceral fat accumulation. And this will actually make a good segue into the body fat thing. Her estrogen may be lower if she gets blood work done. I think this is one of those things that, yes, I absolutely believe it's true, but kind of the mechanisms are less important than what's going on. The problem is the solution, because in my experience, folks that have that sort of psychological approach, getting them to eat more and exercise less is very much an uphill battle. Even if that's really what the solution is, she would probably, like, once you get them to do it and they start losing more effectively while suffering less, which is usually what happens, they feel better, they're not broken down all the time, then they kind of buy into it. But man, getting the initial, I had a client years and years and years ago, again, I didn't know any of this, and same thing, she jumped straight into super low calories, 2 hours of cardio a day, stalled, and I said, look, you need to eat more and exercise less. She goes, how can that work? I said, you're losing nothing right now. It can't be, your results can't be any worse than 0. And she went on a cruise, and for 5 days, she ate more and exercised less, and came back and she lost 2.5 kilos. And I was like, see, and she went right back to path to what I call toxic dieting. And I think women more so than men are still exposed to that. That is what we were taught, what women were taught. That's how you diet. The less you eat, the more exercise, the better your results. And frequently, it's the exact opposite. And again, this goes to differences in women and men. And this actual tie to energy availability, and then I'll loop back to the body fat thing. Men's bodies are much more robust in terms of what they can get away with in terms of dieting before their body, because again, men's systems are real simple. They really are. Women's systems are much more complex. Women's reproductive systems, their physiological systems, can get impacted and disturbed by fairly minor stresses. I mean, let's face it, the number of different issues of different reproductive issues that women can experience is enormous compared to what men deal with, right? Women's reproductive, their fertility, everything can be thrown off by such minor things. Again, don't anybody hear me saying, oh, women are weak. It's not that at all. Just the system is much more sensitive. And there's probably good reasons for that. Okay, so this brings us the long way to what's called energy availability. This will tie a lot of this together. So we know about calories in versus calories out, right? Energy balance, how much you eat versus basal metabolic rate, activity, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, NEAT. Okay. Energy availability, EA, is subtly different, right? It is calorie intake minus exercise calorie expenditure divided by kilograms of lean body mass. And what it conceptually represents is the calories that are left over to the body after exercise has been paid for lack of a better way of putting it. And why this is important is every tissue in the body has to use some amount of energy, right? So as we're sitting here, brain is doing brain things. The brain actually uses a tremendous number of calories for how big it is or how small it is. Your liver is doing liver things. Your kidney is doing kidney things. Your heart is doing heart things. But importantly, different parts of the human or of the human body are more important than others for survival, right? So one of the things that happens with extreme dieting is often hair and nails will stop growing. Some people will have their hair fall out because, as annoying as it may be, having your nails stop growing, you won't die. I mean, you might think you will because your nails don't look good, but you know what I mean. I'm being a little bit facetious here, just to make the point, right? Immune system uses a stunning number of calories. Immune system is impaired when calories are too low because the body has to make a choice. Well, I can keep your heart pumping, which is pretty important, or I can maintain your immune system, which doesn't matter if your heart stops pumping. So it has to make, and what ends up happening is when energy availability gets below a certain point, the body only has so many calories and it has to decide, I'm using this sort of anthropomorphically, right? It has to prioritize. Well, heart's got to keep hearting, lungs got to keep lunging, kidneys got to keep kidneying, immune system. You won't die in the short term if it stops. You won't die if your nails stop. You won't die if your reproductive organs stop working temporarily because they're not important for short-term survival. There's also the logic of if you are starving, right? In a very real way, dieting is just controlled starvation on a longer time frame. Your body doesn't know that you just want to lose fat. All it goes is we're not getting enough food. for a whole bunch of different mechanisms, is probably not the best time to get pregnant because there's no food. There's no food to support the baby. So for years, and when women started entering sport in the 70s, especially into the 80s, they started seeing three things occur in female athletes, which was eating disorders, like clinical eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, things of that nature. They saw reproductive dysfunction. And at the time, all they knew there was the standard menstrual cycle called eumenorrhea. EU just means good or normal, and amenorrhea, the absence of a menstrual cycle. There's also oligomenorrhea, which is a lengthened cycle. That's if a woman has cycles between 35 and 90 days, that's called oligomenorrhea. That can be related to PCOS. That's a whole separate discussion. But so all they saw was you either have a menstrual cycle or you don't. And then they saw loss of bone mineral density, often at the extremes. Like they would measure 15-year-old gymnasts and they would have the bone density of an 80-year-old woman. And they referred to this, unfortunately, in my opinion, as the female athlete triad or FAT, which I just thought was a poor choice, but that's just me. Now, at the time, there were a bunch of different theories as to what was causing it because nobody knew anything about anything. The main one that they believed was that had to do with body fat percentage, right? They knew that children typically won't hit puberty until they hit a critical body fat level. And that's thought to be one of the reasons boys and girls are hitting puberty younger than they used to, is that there's obesity is worse, their body. So the logic made sense. Well, if women get below a certain critical body fat percentage where they can't maintain pregnancy, the body will shut. So that, and people still say that today, that idea still persists, and it made perfect sense. The problem was when they started looking at it, well, you'd find athletes at 12% body fat who still were menstruating and women at 24% that weren't. So, and a researcher named Ann Lukes, whose name will come up a bunch in the next few minutes, was the one who really started looking at this and realized that, yeah, on average, women who'd lost their cycle were a little bit leaner, but there was no critical cutoff. There were other theories having to do with the stress of activity, and some studies supported that, where they threw women into like 10 miles of running a day. But it was really hard to separate things, right? But especially with athletes, because one of the things you saw the loss of menstrual cycle in athletes in fitness sports, distance running, ballet, gymnastics, figure skating, sports that had a primacy on being thin, where you saw the greater risk. Well, most of them were under eating. Most of them were training enormous amounts, and most of them had low body fat. Well, how do you separate those out? How do you say it's one? Maybe it's all of them. Maybe it's none of them. Maybe anything. Maybe we don't know. So it's very hard to separate those two out. I'd also note that in recent years, they've sort of expanded the female athlete triad. It's no longer clinical eating disorder, amenorrhea, low bone, like osteoporotic bone mineral density. Now it's like low food, low calorie intake for activity. And this will all tie together. It is, we know now that there can be a couple of intermediate stages of menstrual cycle dysfunction. First, you get what's called luteal dysfunction, where the luteal phase shortens because the body's not making enough progesterone. Then you get anovulation, where no egg is produced. Now, women will still menstruate, so these are invisible. That's why they didn't know about them. It wasn't until much later that they saw this was going on. So when they go from eumenorrhea, luteal phase dysfunction, she won't even know. And one study showed that as little as 2 hours of running could put women into a luteal phase dysfunction. That's how little it can take. In ovulation, everything still looks normal. And then full-on amenorrhea, where the menstrual cycle, and sometimes oligomenorrhea happens in the middle again, separate discussion. And then simply low bone mineral density for age. If you've got an 18-year-old female athlete and she's one standard deviation below normal bone mineral density, something's wrong. So it's become more of an umbrella to expand. And then let's go back to energy availability, then I'll go where all this is now. So Luke's came along and she said, all right, she thought it was energy availability for whatever reason. So she did these really elegant studies. She took women and for 5 days, she manipulated energy availability, right? Remember, it's calorie intake minus exercise divided by lean body mass in kilos. because fat tissue doesn't use a lot of calories. So muscle's all that matter. She had one group do a ton of exercise, but keep calories the same. She had another group do no exercise and drop calories. So she was really separating these two out, isolating them. And the initial study she did, she took them to some of like 10 kcals per kilogram of lean body mass, energy availability, right? So if a woman had 40 kilos of lean body mass, 450, that means her body had available 450 calories a day, right? And to go back to that definition, let's say you're eating 2,000 calories.
Yeah.
And you do 500 calories of exercise.
Yeah.
That's a 1,500 calorie energy availability.
Yeah.
If you were to do zero activity and eat 1,500 calories, that's the 1,500 calorie energy. You can reach it or whatever combination. Yeah. And she found that essentially both cause the same effect. Now, over 5 days, you don't see menstrual cycle dysfunction. You see hormonal changes. It's got to do with luteinizing hormone pulsatility, and I won't get too far into the weeds in this. But essentially, there was no difference. So she goes, boom, energy availability seems to be when we separate these out. So that was the first study. Then she did a million studies after that. Like, this is her thing, is studying energy availability, and she's really changed the field. She said, okay, now let's develop, we're going to study different degrees of energy availability. So let's generate 40, 30, 20, 10, and see where the problems start. And what she identified at the time was that about 30 kcals per kilogram of lean body mass seemed to be about the critical point where you would start to see changes in hormones. You'd see this change in luteinizing hormone, thyroid hormone would go down. That's sort of when the body perceived the difference. It was about that critical threshold. Now, again, these are 5-day studies. And I mention that because later work has started to look at this in more of a long-term thing. So one of the data points is that, got to phrase this very carefully, having an energy availability below 30 does not mean you will lose your menstrual cycle. However, all female athletes who have lost their menstrual cycle are below 30. Does that make sense? So like going below that, like now those women probably have these luteal phase defect or an ovulation, but they just haven't gone all the way to amenorrhea. But every woman they find with amenorrhea is below that level.
Yeah.
And when they go to treat them, they give them food. And if they bring them above 30, things start to go back to normal. Now, other work has shown, yeah, we'll see it at 32, 30. Again, we're looking at 5 days over many, many months. Things, like I would love to tell women, oh, if you never go below 30, you're never going to see a problem. But eventually, eventually dieting catches up with you, right? Just like all these changes occur. And, as well, the lower value doesn't predict which one will occur, which menstrual cycle dysfunction will occur. The lower it gets, the more likely you are to have a worse problem. But the point of this all being was that really low energy availability was really the driver on this. But again, we see in athletes, they're not eating enough, they're exercise. So of course, energy availability is low. Add to that chronic stress, which add hormones and cortisol and all this other stuff, suddenly we get all these things kind of coming together. A couple of other points. One, it looks like women who have an older, what's called a reproductive age. And what that means, so biological age is how old you are. Reproductive age is how many years since you started menstruating. So a woman starts menstruating at 13 and she's 24 now. Biological age 24, reproductive age 11.
Yeah.
When women hit a reproductive age of about 14 years, their systems become much more resistant to these low energy availability effects. Women's systems just get more stable. The problem being that we're seeing this in adolescent female athletes. This is where that's the problem, is that you've got 17-year-old runners eating too little, training too much, losing their menstrual cycle. They may be losing bone mineral density at the time that the peak time to gain bone mineral density. And if women don't gain it during those peak years, it can be very difficult to rebuild later down the road.
And what about muscle mass? What about lean body mass as well?
There's so many negatives occur with low, like you get poorer recovery during workouts, in between workouts, can lose muscle mass, immune system dysfunction. What they have now, but yeah, it's all negatively impacted. Performance either doesn't improve over the training season, or it goes down frequently.
Yeah.
And
recovery
women are
impacted too. Sorry.
So in recent years, the newest conceptualization of this, they've gone from calling it the female athlete triad, or just the triad, to relative energy deficiency syndrome, RED-S. They did this for a few reasons. One is to really emphasize that the energy availability, it's the relative energy availability that's the problem. They also wanted to take athlete out of it because it can happen to recreational female trainees as well. Yeah. The big controversy, they also wanted to include men. And this caused quite a to-do. There's several papers, and it's kind of like the female researchers and then the IOC were very much at odds. Now, this isn't to say that men can't experience this. Typically, the male athletes, you see it in distance runners, horse jockeys, of all things. Horse jockeys maintain these absurdly low body weights. And they see similar things where they become hypogonadal, they don't produce testosterone. The difference is that the physiological effects to women are profound in terms of the loss of bone mineral density, all this. Men don't have nearly the same negative effects. So the one group was like, the problem with doing this, yes, men should be included, but it's really taking the emphasis away from where it belongs, which is women suffer far greater consequences. And one other thing, this goes back to the robustness and simplicity of men. Whereas women tend to be affected at that 30 level, even men at 15 kcals per kilogram of lean body mass, you won't see problems with bone mineral density. You won't see hormonal problems. And this goes to the dieting thing too. Men can get away with far more extreme dieting than women because their bodies just don't shut down the way women do, right? There is data I have. A woman can start to impair all those hormones within a week of low calories and too much exercise. Within 7 days, she'll see a drop in thyroid hormone, a change in luteinizing hormone that will down the road cause reproductive dysfunction within 7 days. And how many women have we seen do this? Trying to lose weight, like you said, boot camp challenge and 800 calories a day. And by day 7, they're already causing them. Hold that thought. I got to go let my dog out. He's being annoying. You're why I can't have my stuff. And so sort of the corollary to that, right, is there's sort of this idea, and I hate to use metabolic damage, but there is a metabolic dysfunction that starts to occur. And very much this is the same as what happens with dieting in general. Metabolic rates slow down, recovery from training is impaired, metabolism is slowed down due to all this. And it's like, frequently when you get women to reduce their exercise and raise their calories even slightly above that critical threshold, their metabolic rate actually comes back up. And so because like one of the things people forget is that energy expenditure, and here I'm talking about like energy, like total daily energy expenditure, is not a number. It's the moving target. And it can go up in some stages, it can go down in response to dieting. And so what you find is that, all right, so a woman's dieting hard, just killing herself, her energy expenditure is here and she's losing really slowly. She raises her calories up above that critical level, and suddenly energy expenditure goes up. She's still in a deficit without having to be quite so miserable. On top of the other benefits, hormonally, physiologically, she can recover from training. Now, when this data first came out back in, I want to say the 2000s, there was this idea of like, women should never go below that 30 level. Well, that's great in theory, but women who are dieting to extremely low levels of leanness, and here I'm talking about 15%, elite athletes, eventually you got to cross that level. You just do. The goal should be to cross it as late as possible and to stay there for as short a time as possible.
Mm.
And there's a case study I read, this researcher, Trent Stellingworth, followed this elite runner for 7 years. That is dedication. This is a man with a mission. And elite distance runner, and he tracked her, measured metabolic rate, bone density, performance, all this stuff in the lab. And what she did was during her training during the year, she would keep her energy availability fairly high, 40, 45, that's thought to be sufficient. Maintain about 14, 15% body fat. She would diet down to race for 3 months. She would diet down to 10 to 12%, and she would lose her menstrual cycle. And that was just, that was the price. But as soon as her competition season was over, she'd bring her calories right back up, bring her body fat back up slightly, regain reproductive function, have enough calories. Over 7 years, she never got hurt. She increased her muscle mass little by little. I mean, this is a distance runner. We're not talking about needing to be particularly huge. Didn't get injured, set many personal bests, set a couple records. So yeah, she have to cross that 30 eventually, but she tried to stay there for a shorter period of time. But you see women that get into this, not only do they start there, right? Like that's within week 1, they're below that critical threshold and they're already causing problems. They stay there for months on end, and then they won't raise their calories. Whereas, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and then we see teenage girls, we see these girls 15, 16, and then by the time they're 45 or 50, and they're just going, what on earth is wrong with me?
Yeah. And it's different. Adolescents are such a complex situation because the system is still so plastic. The physiology can be affected positively or negatively by so many things. And like, if you look at the data, like on yo-yo dieting in older individuals, you tend not to see like permanent changes. But when you look at adolescents, like you look at like male wrestlers tend to weight cycle a lot and they gain weight and lose weight and gain weight. Later in life, they will have like a permanently impaired metabolic rate. They have done and I think you can see some of the same thing, especially in the sports where, especially female gymnastics, where they will prevent puberty from even occurring for years and years and years. And then when it hits, because essentially at a time of life where their body is still very sensitive to environmental changes, you're basically teaching it, for lack of a better word, store every calorie you can. It also it generates such dysfunctional eating patterns. And the problem is that speaking about this in the abstract and how to avoid it and what to do is great. Come on, we were both 15. If someone had said to us, look, you are going to harm your health when you're 50, we both would have said the same thing. And I don't care. I'm invincible. I can't think that far ahead.
How old is 50? Oh my God,
Well, but and especially if they're a driven athlete, if you go, look, this is, you are going to cause permanent damage to yourself. Athletes will do anything to be the best. And again, unfortunately, adolescent girls are at the highest risk for all of this in general. Women are like 3 times more likely to have eating disorders than men, and that's due to estrogen at puberty. If they're in certain environment, like, can men get them? Yeah. Are men getting them more than they used to in the modern environment? Absolutely.
I'm seeing some of the young male athletes.
Yes. And it's because men are finally getting the same horrible media exposure and horrible unrealistic body images that women have gotten for 50 years. And it's becoming more prevalent in men, but women are still more prone to it for absolutely biological reasons. Couple that with certain types of sports, still certain types of pathological training practices. Coaches still, Bella Caroli is still infamous for telling his girls, you're fat, even when they're eating an apple a day to train 8 hours, because he's from that school of thought. There's 10 more waiting to take your place. I'll do whatever it takes to win. And so, there's a lot of damage that can be. And like I said, if bone mineral density from puberty to about 20 is where women gain most of their bone mineral density, then they gain some more to 30. And you can actually gain bone mineral density later in life, contrary to what used to be believed. But again, menopause, that's a whole separate day because that's its own set of complexities. But if it's not gained then during the critical periods, it may never be completely rebuilt. But again, try telling a 16-year-old athlete, yeah, 40 years from now, you might have osteoporosis. And they'll go,
who cares?
and I don't care. I wouldn't have cared. I mean, even in my 20s, I did a lot of sports that I knew would beat me up. Like, you know what? But I was aware of it. I'm like, I hoped that by the time I got to this age, they'd have arthritis cured, and they haven't. So I'm just like, well, I paid the price for my youthful indiscretions. I took my chances, and this is what happened. But again, women can be so much permanently harmed by this than men. Like I said, catastrophic ACL injuries, concussions as women are entering combat sports, boxing, mixed martial arts, American football, even from heading a ball in soccer, what everybody else calls football. And if they get a concussion, they're much worse outcome from it. Greater risk of hyponatremia in endurance sports, much worse outcome if it does occur. Can get stress incontinence, usually an impact jumping sports. All these things can be addressed with training, but aren't, because the information's not out there. The coaches, who just have to, usually are males, female strength coaches, again, in the US, don't typically, either they don't exist or they're not expected to have the same qualifications. The girls don't have access to the weight room during the summer. The boys sure as hell do. The coaches want those boys in the weight room getting ready for football in the spring. Girls, they're not given programs. They're not given the training that they need. And they get into trouble later.
With the general population, going to gyms and having coaches and personal trainers, also those people tend to be athletic and they tend to be quite gifted. And the clients are trying to do the kind of workouts they do, and they're trying to, believe that they're going to have the same sort of body type and body composition.
This has been a problem I've noticed, is that people who become trainers typically are started young, got to the gym when they were 15. I mean, I did. They were athletic, they were motivated, they wanted to be there. And frequently they don't truly understand their client base, who is as often as not the opposite of that. Now, again, I'm generalizing, things are changing. However, so they're like, I'm motivated, I'm driven. I've seen trainers forget, like they've been doing this for a decade. Some beginner comes in and they give them like, I'm just going to give them the workout I do. Dude, you've been doing this for a decade. Do you not remember when you were a beginner? And of course, the answer is they don't. One of the best trainers I know, it's the guy who's on my Facebook wall. His name is Darko Botic, B-O-T-I-C. And he was extremely overweight most of his life. And he's lost something like 75 kilos. He's lost like half a body. He understands those issues better than the average trainer who's never been that can. Right? Because it's tough. You don't have a concept for it. If you've never been that heavy, if you're training someone who's 125 kilos, who's not very active. When I was a trainer, when I used to train general population more, for some reason I was aware of that. And I'm like, okay, look, this person is starting. They probably had a horrible early experience. I need to give them stuff they can feel successful at. I don't want to give them exercises that make them embarrassed. I'm not going to have them do a barbell back squat so all they feel is self-conscious, uncoordinated, get sore, hate what they're doing. I'm not like, if I want to do abdominal work, I'm going to put them on an abdominal machine, because for right or for wrong, I'm like, I don't want them, they may feel self-conscious having to get up and down off the floor. It was hard enough for them to come into a public gym, looking at this, having people possibly or possibly not look at them and judge them. It was hard enough for them to come, and now I'm going to make them feel like they can't do this. But a lot of trainers don't realize, but trainers that have come from that background, who know what it was like, have an empathy, have an understanding, have a sympathy. This is semi-unrelated, but I think it is both unrelated and related. Somebody told me a story. It was a bra company in the US, and it would hire male employees, right? And I know about as much about bras as the average. and it would make them wear a weighted bra on there for a month, so they could have some sort of conceptualization of what that's like, the stress it puts on the upper back, on the lower back, physicality of that. And now I reverse it. I go, you know what? If we could find a way to give every male on the planet to have a menstrual cycle for a couple of months, oh man, it would smooth out interpersonal issues. Because guys, we don't understand. How can we, right? Sort of the reverse of that. I've known women who use testosterone at whatever level, and they do that, and suddenly they're like, oh, I get it. I get men now. I get it. I get the aggression. I get the relentless sex drive. They're like, I understand now in a way that I couldn't before. But the point of this all being that I think it wouldn't be the same, but if you made every trainer go, look, for the first 2 weeks, we're going to put one of those, fat suits, sumo suits on you, so you have some conception of what it's like to move around in this. And I know it's not the same. They've got more muscle. I can get that, but just to see how people look at you, to see the response you get comparatively, that would increase empathy. So I think my point being, you're absolutely right. You're seeing people that were fit, did this from a young age, probably are not genetically average, training folks that are. And there is that expectation. And this is a place where social media, especially, it's done a lot of good. But in hindsight, I'm starting to think the internet was a mistake.
Yeah.
And I'm half joking about that, and I'm half not joking about that. They're doing studies now looking at the impact of like Instagram fitness influencers on people's perception of them. This is not a joke, because you have the elite 1% holding themselves up as the standard. And it is completely skewed everyone's idea of what normal is to almost a greater degree. Like, okay, 20 years ago, the image women were given, impossible image women were given were of skinny supermodels who were a size 0 and weighed 45 kilos. Now, the impossible image just happens to be muscular with abdominals and cut legs. And for men, it's same thing. If you don't have a visible six-pack, if you're not cut like the guy in the movies, like Wolverine, like Ryan Reynolds, like if you don't look like that, you're less, and that's what we're seeing the same thing in men. At the same time, one thing I have seen positive come out of social media is it's got more women in the weight room, right? When I was coming up, it was 95% men in the weight room, 5%, if that, right? It just wasn't a place where women were accepted. There was still all those ideas. If you lift weights, it'll make you a man. No man will ever want you. Your ovaries will fall out, all that same old thing. I have seen a step change over the last 30 years. In that now, and this is true in most sports, used to be that like at the first Olympics, there were 0 women. At the second Olympics, there were like 2 women. And these were women that were like, you just know, like, think about 1904. The women who would have been like, F you, I'm going to compete. And you can sort of picture what that woman would have for the day, right? That's every, fast talking, hard talking woman from 1920s movies would have just been like, I'm going to do what I'm like. But it's now in most sports at the Olympics, it's about 45% women, 55% men. It's approaching parity. I've seen that occur in powerlifting, in the weight room. CrossFit, like it or hate it, it is partly responsible for that because they told people you can lift weights and it'll be good for you. I mean, they hurt a lot of people, but that's a whole separate thing. But what I've seen a lot on social media, because what was women's fears? Oh, if I lift weights, I'm going to end up like these pro-female bodybuilders on the drugs. And they're seeing that, and I'm going to be real careful with my language again here, that women can lift very heavy weights. We've got some fantastic elite female power lifters. Steffi Cohen deadlifting 600 pounds, 280-ish kilos, and still looking, and again, I hate such a loaded word, still looking feminine. By that, I mean traditionally feminine. I'm in the US, I got to be real careful with this. Like, feminine is defined by being a female, in a traditional sense. Going, oh, look, something else I'm really seeing in powerlifting, powerlifting is a very egalitarian sport. I don't know if you're super familiar with it, and Olympic lifting too. There's weight classes ranging from 42 kilos to 100 kilos plus. And all anybody cares about is that you came and lifted the weight. Appearance doesn't matter. It matters what you do on the platform. And I've run into women, and same thing, women's powerlifting, when in the 1970s, there was one female powerlifter, Jan Todd. And the only reason she was competing is because her husband was. Terry Todd. And again, she is this badass chick. Her and her husband ran this strength history thing at UT Austin. But she's like, I'm competing whether you like it or not. And she did. Now they're holding women's only events. There's so many women. But I've run into women that they knew that they were never going to have the appearance of an Instagram fitness influencer. That's the best way I can put it. And one I talked to especially, she came, she had a great meet. She pulled some ridiculous amount of weight off the floor. And she just goes, you know what? I can never do that. But by God, I can do this. Like, she had found her sport, because nobody cares. If you come and you show up and you pull the weight, you've won. So I've seen a big step change there. And I don't know how we got on this from whatever we were talking about. But the point of this all being that social media has altered some of that, but it has given people, most of the male fitness influencers use steroids. It's just the truth of the matter. Men are now thinking, I can achieve that naturally. No, you can't. No amount of training you can do will ever make you look like that. Because they're all on drugs. Even the women, they're using little something sometimes, little thyroid, little clenbuterol, little winstrol, just a little bit. And it is creating very much, it's a different set of unrealistic standards. And yeah, you absolutely see that in the gym. And you see that the trainers who are, and they're obsessive compulsive neurotics. And I mean, I don't necessarily say it's a bad thing. It is what you have to be at that level all the time. And the average person, I don't think, that may or may not be in the cards. That may or may not be realistic, and it can cause a lot of mental stress if they expect themselves, or if they're being told, oh, this is the norm. No, this is the 1%. People used to look at like physique shows, female bodybuilding and classic physique and fitness and bikini, and go, oh my God. Thing is, they look like that one day out of the year. You're not seeing them the rest of the year when they're not in shape and they're fluffy at 24% body fat. You're seeing them that way. And they use pathological, unhealthy, almost eating disordered eating. And a lot of them do end up with eating disorders. You don't hear about that. You don't see that. What you see is the one day of perfection with lighting and oil and posing and camera work and Photoshop, which they then hold up as, So yeah, they're good. There's good and bad, but yeah, just to your point, for the general population, it may or may not be realistic, and there's no way to tell. Again, when I did a recent consult, lofty goals are not necessarily a bad thing, but there has to be a reality check. And I'm like, I can't necessarily say that you will or like, but this is what's involved. This is what you have to be aware of, and you may have to make some hard choices at some point to go, do I want to put in the work? As you get, it gets harder and harder and harder. And but of course that drives $1 billion supplement industry and a diet book industry that promises quick and easy results. And trust me, I wish they were there. I wish it were quick and easy. I'd make a lot more money if I told people that, but it's not. It does take, but yes, anyway, going back and forth to your point, absolutely, I think that's a problem in that sense. And then especially if you got, the reality is the average trainer knows how to train one person, themselves. And they just give everybody the workout they do. I had a client years ago. She had just undergone a double mastectomy to breast cancer. Went to a generic gym trainer. The first day, he had her do a 20-set chest workout. Brilliant.
I've actually seen that.
Yeah. It's more common than, and it's unfortunate, more so in the US. To become a trainer, you need to take a 3-day course and go to a gym. There, the barrier for entry is a curb about that big. If you're fit, you can be a trainer. Now, I knew someone who lived in Australia. I don't know what the New Zealand regulations are. In Australia, they want you to do a 6-month internship underneath like a qualified, someone who's an experienced trainer before you actually start training people. It's a much more demanding certification process. But the US, for good or for bad, we are the Wild West of capitalism. Outside of a few things where you have to be licensed, pretty much put up a shingle and you're whatever you want to be. To be a dietitian, you have to have a degree. To be a nutritionist, you just have to print business cards.
Yeah, New Zealand, the organisations are voluntary, so,
Okay.
and you can do training, and lots of personal trainers do what you say, and they do short courses and things like that. And there are some who do degrees,
Yes.
and people like me who've done degrees, but, a lot of them are 40-hour courses, online courses, and things like that, and yeah. But anyway. Hey, I was just wondering, you did say you'd be happy to come back.
Sure.
Are you happy to come back? And
oh, absolutely. I love talking about this stuff and hearing myself talk. And this is information that needs to be out there because it's just it's not talked about. I do want to just, one thing I skipped, and I always talk way too long. If you've got a few minutes, let me address the difference in body fat distribution. All right, body composition. Because like I said, this is typically we have focused on scale weight. And I think, I don't know if it's women more so than men, but again, women's dieting culture is eternal. Men's dieting culture is relatively new in a general population sense. And the scale was always the metric. I knew somebody one time, she was 6'2", which is a lot of centimeters. It's over 2 meters. She wanted to weigh 60 kilos. And I go, not unless we cut off a leg. And I asked her, I go, where did that number come from? Because it's so arbitrary. And I don't think she had an answer for me. I don't know, like that's, if you're bench pressing, the bar plus 2 20-kilo plates, like that's a fairly, like that's, like, is it that? Is it so you can be bench pressed? Where did this completely arbitrary value come from? And but basically what it comes down to is women frequently live and die by the scale. If it goes down, cool, reward yourself with cake. If it goes up, well, time to go do 2 more hours of cardio and starve myself. Like it's a very, and again, the scale can be a great tool if you use it properly. And like I said, weigh every day, put it into one of those apps that will average it out. Look at the trend line. If it's going down, you're losing. If it's flat, because there is noise, right? Body weight can vary. I mean, you can have 2 kilos of undigested food in your gut at any given time. Water weight, how much sodium did you have? Women, where are you in the menstrual cycle? Stress, all these other things. Body weight can just go up and down. And if you live by those daily scale changes, you're going to go crazy because it's not going to tell you anything. At least when you use an rolling average, it averages out. Some women just shouldn't use the scale. If the scale drives you nuts, just find a better tool. Right, so that brings us to body composition, which started to become a thing, I think, in the 80s. Even you look at early 60s and 70s studies, they're just like, we did this, people lost weight. And I mean, we can't hold 50-year-old research to today's standards. Nobody knew anything about anything. That's all anybody cared about. And then we got into the body composition era. So body composition refers to what you're made of. And here I don't mean sugar and spice and everything nice. Do you have that line? Is that a thing over?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm never sure what's a US thing and what's not, but that's what little girls are.
Slugs and snails and puppy dogs' tails.
Yeah, that's what little boys are made of. And you can divide it up in like there's four component models, and it's basically right. So your body is made of all this different stuff: muscle mass, organs, bone, ligaments, tendons, water, minerals, body fat, right? And some, like DEXA will measure these out in some detail. Usually to keep it simple, we divide it up into 2 components. One is fat mass. That's everything on your body that's fat. And everything else is lean body mass. And that includes muscle, bone, ligaments, organs, minerals, water. And this is where we will get into issues with measuring lean body mass, right? If you lose water, technically you've lost lean body mass. Is that muscle mass? No, just water, but it is still technically lean body mass. Let's focus on the fat mass part of it. So there's different types of body fat, and I'll focus on 3. One is called variously brown adipose tissue, beige adipose tissue, bright adipose tissue. It's weird, 3 different names. It's all the same acronym. Come on, scientists, get it together. It is a type of fat that burns other fat and generates heat. There's still a lot of debate over how much we have, how relevant it is, how important it is. For years, they didn't think humans had it at all. Like babies had it, lumberjacks have it, believe it or not, because it generates heat if you're in cold all the time. And they would measure and they couldn't find it. And then some research group was looking at something else and they happened to have people in the cold. They're doing like a PET scan and they were like, what's that? I think they're looking for cancer or something. And they're like, wait, what's that on the scanner? And they went and looked and they're like, it's brown fat. We have to measure it when people are cold because that's what causes it to turn on. Yeah. Still debatable what role it plays. They want it to be an anti-obesity tissue, but here's the thing. Women have more than men, and I dare say women don't have an easier time losing body fat. So I question its relevance under most conditions. All right, so we're going to put that away. There's visceral fat. Visceral fat is the fat that surrounds the organs. It's very deep. Typically, you see it more in men. Testosterone tends to promote visceral fat accumulation. Estrogen tends to prevent visceral fat accumulation. And it's not really visible in the way the third type of fat is, but it makes your stomach very hard. Like if you find a male that like you've seen them at the extremes, they look like they ate a balloon. Like that's this, but like it's not visibly a lot of body fat. It's just their stomach is just like it's just rock. That's visceral fat. Now you do see this in women with polycystic ovary syndrome who typically have elevated testosterone. They tend to gain visceral fat after menopause. Due to the lack of estrogen, women may gain visceral fat. When women gain a large amount of body fat, and here I'm talking like 40% body fat and higher, they may gain visceral fat. But by and large, women tend to be it tends to be more of a male body fat pattern. The rest of it we just call subcutaneous fat. And that's the fat that's underneath the skin. That's the stuff that we see and then we want to get rid of. Yeah. And it's called white fat, white adipose tissue to distinguish it from the brown, but whatever, just call it body fat. Now, numerically, right? So body composition is expressed as a percentage, right? If you have 25% body fat, that means 25% of you is fat, all of it, including breast tissue. I had someone once tell me women have higher body fat percentages than men, and she was very upset. She's like, but some of it's in my boobs, that shouldn't count. I go, well, but it does. I mean, it just does. It's just the way of it, right? It counts in the equation. On average, women have 10 to 11% higher body fat than men at any given weight, right? There's a fourth type of fat called essential fat. Essential fat surrounds the organs, brain, stuff. If you can't lose it, and if you did, you'd be dead. On average, men's essential fat is about 3 to 4%. Women's is about 8 to 10%. So, and this is part of the difference in body fat percentage, is that different, and then the rest is just differences in body fat. So what this means is that the lower limit of body fat for men, like if you were to look at like the leanest of lean athletes, about 4%. For women, 10. You occasionally see 8. That's just got to do with the way the equation. DEXA measures people higher by than other methods. I don't know why exactly, it just does. DEXA also does that weird thing. It gives you a different number for upper body and lower body, which is relevant to what we're going to. So anyway, men on average, 15 to 18% body fat. Like we're just looking at the general population. Women, 18 to 25% on average. As you start to get up in 30, 40, you will see 50%, even 60% at the very extremes of obesity. So those are kind of average, and changes there are much more relevant than changes in scale weight. And here's a good example, right? So let's say you're a woman and you have whatever, you're 25% body fat, which means 75% is everything else. All right, you start proper diet and training program. You gain 2 kilos of muscle and you lose 2 kilos of fat. Scale weight hasn't changed, but your body composition has. Your body fat percentage will go down. I'm not going to try to do the math in my head. Same thing, if you gain 5 kilos of muscle, which would be a lot for a woman, and lose 5 kilos of fat, your scale weight hasn't changed, but your body fat percentage has. Your body composition has improved. Even at the same weight, because muscle is denser than fat, you will have lost inches. You will have you will be smaller. Again, muscle, one kilo of muscle is denser than a kilo of fat. There's pictures online, like go and like they've got, here's 5 kilos of muscle and it looks like a big old steak. And here's this glob, 5 kilos and you can see the difference in size. So in that sense, body composition is more important. Now, when we talk about scale weight, if you've got someone, a beginner who's carrying a lot of body fat, generally scale fat loss and weight loss will tend to be fairly the same, right? Women don't gain muscle tremendously quickly. Like over a 6-month training program, initial training, they might gain 2 to 3 kilos of muscle. So it's not like you're going to lose 10 kilos of fat and gain 10 kilos of muscle over a 3-month or a 6-month span, right? You might gain a little muscle and lose a lot of fat, because fat loss will be happening to a greater degree. But it's just, especially in those early stages, one of the things I would see with beginner trainees, because it's easier to gain muscle when you're beginner, it's generally easier to lose fat, is like first 3 or 4 weeks, scale weight wouldn't move. But then I'd measure them with calipers or whatever body composition method. And I'd be like, look, you gained 3 or 4 pounds of muscle, 1.5 kilos of muscle, while you lost 1.5 kilos of fat. And then after that, their scale weight would start to drop because the fat loss would continue. So body composition is more relevant. It's hard to say if it's as impacted through menstrual cycle dynamics. Depends on the method. Like some scales will use electrical impedance, which is very affected by water balance. Others, not so much. Generally, even with that, if a woman is going to use one of the various body composition methods, again, compare week to week. Compare week 1 to week 1, week 2 to week. Consistency is more important than accuracy here. And all the equations are off by a few percentage points. Like, we're more interested in consistency in the change over time. And you can use tape measurements can actually be super accurate if you use them well. Like that clothing fit can give you a very good indication. So that's body composition is arguably more important. It can be harder to measure depending on the method being used.
What about the difference in fat storage where women store fat and men?
Yes, let me loop back around. So we talked about, here I'm going to focus mainly on subcutaneous fat. In general, men tend to store fat viscerally and around the midsection, right? They call that an apple shape. Men tend to be rounder and tend to not carry a lot of body fat in their hips and thighs. Now, there are exceptions. There are some men with more of a female body fat pattern. But by and large, and like I'm an example. I did calipers for years. So my skin fold is these little pinchers you use to measure body fat. My thigh skin fold is about 3 to 4 millimeters, basically no fat. I've ranged from a low body weight of 65 kilos to 100 kilos. My thigh skin fold never changed.
Yeah.
However, my waist sure changed. Yeah. It's been from 32 inches to 44 inches, like 12 inches. It's, what's that, 6 centimeters? Like it changed humongously, like 5 different sizes of pair of pants. Mm. So men tend to store body fat more centrally, visceral fat, abdominal. Women tend to have the classic pear shape, narrow on top, hips and thighs. They tend to store fat, glutes and hips, thigh area. So male is called a gynoid fat pattern. No, sorry, it's an android fat pattern, and the lower body is a gynoid fat pattern. Apple and pear. Again, do some women carry more body fat in the upper body? Yeah, PCOS causes that. Like I said, causes the increased central fat deposition. Women who enter menopause who don't go on hormone replacement often see a shift from lower body to more of a central fat patterning. As women gain a lot of body fat, they start to store central fats. But as men gain a lot of body fat, they start to store hip and thigh fat. Thus is the balance of the universe maintained.
And is that due to sort of like hypertrophy and hyperplasia of fat cells? Does that?
That is part of it. So for listeners, hypertrophy means that the fat cells get bigger. Hyperplasia means that the body makes new fat cells. Now, we used to think years ago that the fat cells you had at birth was all you ever had. We know that's not true now. You can gain fat cells, you can lose fat cells. It's a lot easier to gain them than to lose them. And puberty is one time when there may be increased fat cell number. Pregnancy, it can occur. Women actually gain, abdominal fat tends to hypertrophy. Women's lower body fat tends to undergo hyperplasia, and women's lower body makes new fat cells. So that's part of it for sure. And this is hormonal, make no mistake. Estrogen and progesterone, at puberty, because again, a lot of this we can identify occurring at puberty. Well, what changes at puberty? Hormones interacting with genetics, right? Women's fat cells are different than men's fat cells, but when testosterone goes up, it promotes fat in one area and prevents fat in another area. When women's estrogen and progesterone start getting produced, promotes fat storage in one area and prevents fat storage in the other area. And you get sort of those stereotypical body types. So you've got that going on. And progesterone especially tends to promote lower body fat gain. The mechanism is not worth getting into. It does. And part of the reason why is, well, we'll come back to that, the pregnancy thing. We also have identified, and they know now, is that upper body fat patterns are much more unhealthy in terms of causing a risk for diabetes, heart attack, basically the diseases that men are more prone to. Right? Women are very much protected from heart disease, diabetes, insulin resistance, because lower body fat is much more metabolically inert. Right? Visceral fat is dumping fatty acid in the bloodstream. That causes a lot of problems. Men's abdominal fat is fairly active. Women's lower body fat, not so much, for a bunch of other boring reasons. So that gynoid fat pattern, that lower body fat pattern, is metabolically much more healthy. Right? And this is also something, we go back to the 80s, and it was like, oh, high body fat is unhealthy. And they started looking at it going, women at a higher body fat don't have the same disease risks as men. Now, after menopause, that reverses and women become, but again, everything, that protective effect of estrogen goes away at menopause. So, and they've done a ton of studies. I wrote an entire book on it called that talks to people that want to really get into the weeds on this. There's differences in blood flow. There's differences in the receptors in the fat cells and how they respond to hormones, how they store fat, how they release fat. And sort of the short version of a long story is that visceral fat is very easy. It's very metabolically active. It's very easy to get fat cells out of there, or fat out of the fat cells. And actually those fat cells will go away. They'll die when you lose it, and they'll come right back. Abdominal fat is a little bit harder. And even there in men, like when men start to diet down, they get like their upper abdominal area comes in and their lower abdominal area. Then for men, it's like the love handles and low back is typically a problem area. Men will come into my forum and go, I'm lean, but I've still got this lower abdominal fat. What's wrong with me? I go, you were born male. That's your big defect. That's just the nature of it. That's the last place for it to go. And then hip and thigh fat is the hardest. It has the lowest blood flow. It is the most resistant to hormonal stimulation of fat mobilization. Women do this very interesting thing. This is you will remember this probably. When women eat a fatty meal, the fat is actually stored in her upper body, which is kind of runs counter to what we think. The researchers were surprised. But over time, women can release fat from the upper body. If it's not burned off for fuel, it'll get stored in her hips and thighs. It migrates over time. And back in the 90s, you'd have women dieting going, look, I'm getting leaner in my upper body and my lower body is getting fatter. And we all went, that's impossible. You're out of your mind. Well, guess what? We were wrong. It absolutely can work that way. Women's bodies have the ability to mobilize fat from it. So if it gets burned off, it doesn't, but over time. And the reason for all of this is, part of it gives women a body shape that we know tends to be sexually, a sexual attractant with,
nice curves.
Yes, waist to hip ratio and all of that, fertility and all that stuff. But under normal conditions, that fat is easy to store and hard to get out when you diet and when you train. And to wrap up, after I talk about this one thing, I'll give women an actual actionable point that will help with this. because the way women typically diet and exercise is the worst way to get rid of lower body fat. However, during pregnancy, this reverses. Hip and thigh fat becomes the easiest to mobilize because it exists for that purpose. That's why women's bodies want to store fat after ovulation, just in case. Just in case she gets pregnant, we want to make sure we have enough calories down there. For a couple of years, I wanted to try to mimic the hormonal profile of pregnancy to try to help women with lower body fat. The project never went anywhere and I gave up. I could probably do it now that I know a little bit more. And women, you probably know women that have done this. Even if they don't actively diet, when they start especially when they start breastfeeding, the body fat drops off. Because it's about 300 calories a day just to support breast milk.
Right. I've had 4 kids and I just found that happen. I didn't diet at all. It just... Right.
Yes, like you don't have to really cut calories. You just keep eating normally because women's bodies are supreme. Like even women who are starving to death, their bodies will eat themselves to make milk. Like literally their bodies will find a way to produce as much milk as is possible. So that hip and thigh fat exists to support pregnancy. And again, women will go, but I don't want to get pregnant. I go, well, your body doesn't care. Your body does not know that, unfortunately, and we have no way to tell it that. So those are the major differences. And again, women with PCOS tend to be more central and it can change throughout the lifespan, but that's sort of the typical body fat pattern. Now, without getting too far into the weeds, these differences in hormonal response. For a bunch of, again, very technical, boring reasons, women's hip and lower body fat is mobilized very poorly during low intensity activity. Now, what is the traditional way of women dieting then? They eat all the carbs, insufficient protein. That's a very typical way. Women will be like, I got up, had a bagel and orange juice, had a salad for lunch, and I maybe had, 300-400 grams of chicken at dinner. And you're like, where's the protein? Right? I heard you mention that earlier. Like if there were 2 things I could get women to do, it would be get enough protein, resistance train, everything else is details. And when women do that, life-changing. Because what do they typically do is overeat carbs and do hours of low intensity cardio. Yeah. Creating a huge low energy availability right off the bat, not giving their body the protein to recover, not getting enough calories in general, doing a type of exercise that's not particular, because when you do higher intensity activity, that overcomes this resistance in the lower body, women's lower body fat to mobilizing fat. So what did we start seeing? Suddenly we went from the 80s and the 90s, where women just did nothing but endless cardio. Interval training got really popular in the 2000s. Women started doing harder weight training rather than just going and lifting the 1.5 kilo weights for 1 million repetitions. As soon as it became more socio-culturally acceptable for women to go hard. And again, like it or hate it, CrossFit is all about intensity. Like I said, you can't do high intensity all the time. That's the problem with CrossFit. It's okay if you want to go blow yourself out a couple of times a week, great. You can't do that 7 days a week, and that's what people went to the other extreme. But doing that, and I've got a couple studies, older studies, and they were like, all right, because they do these things, and they're like, all right, we took women and we measured their fat loss, and it was 100% upper body fat because we did low intensity activity. And then we had them do either intense weight training or intervals, and we measured regional fat loss, upper body and lower body. And it's like, they lost 30% more lower body fat than the group that did low intensity. And I'm like, there's a lesson here. And like I've written, protocols where you do like a short interval workout, and you go 45 to 60 seconds hard and 60 seconds easy, do 5 repeats of that, and then do low intensity cardio after, because the high intensity mobilizes the fat and then the low intensity burns it for fuel. Because again, women's bodies will be happy, like, didn't get burned off, cool, put it right back where it was.
Yeah. I think also one of the issues for women doing higher intensity work with their lower body is they get scared of building muscle, and then they feel like they've got bigger. This
is absolutely very true. And one of the things, especially with weight training, there's kind of this initial increase in water and carbohydrate storage, and women feel bulky. Because if you look at the actual muscle gain, it can't happen but that's that sounds very dismissive. It's like, I don't want to like deny it, because it does, and you feel bulky and your clothes don't fit and you're like, screw this. You know, part of it, when I say going higher intensity, it doesn't necessarily have to be heavier, right? Even when you get women working, you know, hard for 15 repetitions to keep it, they can still keep it lighter, but what have we traditionally seen women do? They go and they do 15 reps, or they do 50 reps, or with a weight that, you know, there's a very famous celebrity trainer in the US that says women should never lift more than 1.5 kilos because it'll make them bulky. I just want to ask her, what about women who've just had a child? That baby's more than that. I don't see many pregnant women getting particularly bulked up. Anyway, there's a lot of dumb in the fitness industry, regardless. So yeah, and what I would tell women is like, yeah, the first couple of weeks of doing that, your body will probably store more carbohydrates in the muscle. That goes away pretty quickly. Or, you know, if you prefer, you can do it with high intensity interval training. You know, get on an elliptical, a bike, a rowing machine, you know, do your high intensity work there a couple times a week. And then, so the weight training doesn't have to be quite as intensive. But yeah, it happens to all in the first couple of weeks, then it generally goes away.
But the key point you're making is do the high intensity lower body work and then follow it up with some low intensity cardio to burn the fat off.
Yes, and that can still be done. You know, you can still do like weight training, kind of, you know, more metabolic work, and that's kind of what CrossFit is. You know, where like I don't think you should do the Olympic lifts for sets of 30, quite honestly. But you know, if you want to do a little bit of traditional heavy weight training and do whatever it is, battle ropes, kettlebell swings, you know, things like that for multiple sets of 15 on a short rest. So it's more of a metabolic stressor, because what you need is the hormonal response. What you need is to basically jack your heart rate up for 45 to 60 seconds. That's the hormonal response that mobilizes that fat, and then go trudge on the treadmill for 30 minutes. That will be a lot better for you than doing, I mean, I used to see women on the cardio deck for 2 straight hours and then go do an aerobics class. Like, weight, and again, causing all the problems we talked about, and they would have their knees braced, you know, everything hurts, everything's achy, and they're just not getting results. What I saw, and what I'm sure you've seen, you get women who've done that. They've done high carb, no protein, low fat, you know, fooling around in the weight room, nothing but low intensity cardio. 2 years, nothing. And you finally get them to start weight training and pushing themselves a little bit. They increase their protein, which invariably brings carbohydrates down to even moderate levels.
Yeah.
It's a magic trick. 2 months later, they're like, oh God, I've wasted years. Like, you see more changes in a 2-year span, or sorry, in a 2-month span than they saw in 2 years of following that old. And like, even the trainers I've known are like, oh, but look at runners. Well, they're super skinny. They have no muscle mass, but you know what? They usually do 2 high intensity days a week. They're not just doing the long runs. Even one of the trainers I knew years ago, female trainer, and I mean, she was in great shape. Did she do low intensity cardio? Sure. But I watched her bust her butt in the weight room 3 days a week too. And I'm like, that's what's giving her the body. The cardio is helping, but, and I guarantee you her diet, because invariably when women get into that weight training subculture, eating more protein is just part and parcel of it. Usually that comes with moderating dietary fat, and that means their carbs have to come down, and that's when the magic happens.
Yeah, I was so
probably good to wrap up.
I was so fortunate when I was young, because I was running marathons and I got injured, and my doctor, and I didn't know anything, you know, 20 years old, and my doctor said to me, oh, you can't run anymore. And I went to the local weight shop and I bought this book about weight training for women.
Yeah.
And so I started with these little weights and learning these exercises. And I mean, it's just been such a blessing in my life that happened, you know?
Yeah, and that's very atypical. Again, I don't know when this was in your life, but again,
that was in the 1980s. It was 40 years ago, 43 years ago.
But that's, and I don't know, maybe it's just different. For someone in the 1980s, like weight training for women just really wasn't a thing outside of, I mean, it was even more of a niche subculture than for the men. Just always been part of men's growing up, and it's only now, and now it is really, and again, it's really interesting to me watching this over, my 30-year career. And I mean, I started lifting when I was 15, about 85, and just watching it change is generationally, right? So my mom was of the starvation, women didn't weight train, your ovaries will fall out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 80s, a little bit of a difference, but we've now reached the point where we've had a whole generation grow up lifting. So it's in a very real way, like as I see it, like the box has been opened, like, because now their daughters, and also with a much better approach to eating habits and much more balanced and better nutrition, the toxic diet information will always be out there. You can still go online and Google women's weight loss and see the same old terrible advice you've seen, and that's never going to go away. But we've now had a generation that came up lifting, and guess what? That's what their daughters are going to do. My prediction, we'll see if this is the case, and we can wrap up. There's been, again, that step change. We went from 0% women in sport in the turn of the 20th century. It was like 20 or 30% by the 70s. In the US, Schedule 12 was what really changed the game. Legally, all public schools had to offer women the same opportunities as men across the board.
Right.
It just happened to apply to sport. And the question that for years had been, do women not get involved in sport because they're not interested or because it's not available? And it was the second one. Because as soon as women were given access to sport, what you saw is that men's high school sporting involvement didn't really change. And women just kept going up and up and up. Because they finally had access to it. Was it still as accepted? No. Were women still called horrible names? And there's nothing more damaging to a male ego than to have a woman outlift you. That's why I love training women, because most of my women have better technique and better form. And I love taking them into the weight room and just, it gives me such great joy. Anyway, now we're at the point where it's like women are about 45% at the Olympics, almost achieving parity. I think in American sport, it's not quite there because American football is such a huge sport in this country. I think if we took that out, it'd be about even for women and men. There's also a couple of sports that there's not a women's division yet, but we're getting there. Anyway, I predict that in the next 10 or 20 years, we will actually have more women in sport than men, because there's so many sociocultural changes. Now, boys are growing up and they want to play esports. They want to play competitive video games. I grew up, I played Little League baseball, I played soccer, I did all of that. That's not part of really most kids' upbringing anymore. Whereas the sociocultural dynamic of women entering sport, women have sports heroes. There's a big push for, equality or equity at that level of sport. And I mean, and I remember, you remember too, they did a great movieization of Billie Jean King. Great movie they made she was one of the first ones to really push. She's like, by God, we're going to make a women's tennis federation. And if you don't like it, tough. And they took all the women and she just did it. And but it accelerates. Every generation is coming up seeing more, and they want to aspire to that. And boys want to aspire to play StarCraft. So it won't surprise me if at least some activities, women are actually that there are more women in sport than men, at least some sport. We'll see. But we're almost at 50-50 in the grand majority of sports, which is
great.
It's been amazing to watch, to be sure.
Yeah, no, it's great. And we've got plenty of good women sporting heroes over here. So hopefully that will keep improving. Well, this has been absolutely amazing, and you've been talking for 2.25 hours. So thank you.
As long as you let me.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I know I would love to have you back, because there's just so much more I could talk to you about, and I'd like to talk to you about PCOS. I'd like to talk to you about menopause, and And there's still a lot more on the same topic that we could delve into as well.
I'd love to. I want this information to be more out there so that women at least have it. I don't know what it's like. There's still very much a stigma about talking about these things. I did a thing about a year ago, and there was this mostly UK, and she was almost embarrassed to ask a question about her menstrual cycle. Now it's cultural, but even so, there's still many. And it's just not talked about, and the information's not there, and it is important. I've had women tell me, this isn't meant to be a brag. They're like, I didn't know this stuff till I read your book. They're like, you know more about my menstrual cycle than I do. And it's because I spent 3.5 years reading it. It's not taught. It's not talked about. It's still just, these are important issues.
I had exactly the same thought. I read your book and I thought, there's a man teaching me about, how my body works. It was pretty amazing, and I was so grateful that you said you would come on, because I thought every woman needs to read your book and hear this stuff. Will make a big difference in their lives. So
yeah, no, I'm trying. I wanted to definitely, like I said, the more it's out there, the better, and the happier that I am, the more information, good information. So there's still a lot of bad stuff out there, and there's still a lot of that old 30, 40-year-old crapola that we're never going to get rid of completely, but it's getting better for sure. And through, the work of folks like yourself who are making sure that it gets out there to a new audience.
Doing our best. I'll put a link to your website in the show notes. Do you just want to tell people where they can find you on Facebook? Because you've got the Body Recomposition Facebook site.
Yes, so my website is bodyrecomposition.com. I've got like 400 articles, because I've been on the internet forever, since 1993. I've been there forever. I have a very active Facebook group also called Body Recomposition. I always like to mention, I tend to attract experts in their own field, right? I have like 5 top-notch physios, 2 of whom are surgeons. I actually have an excellent OBGYN who can address medical stuff, which is really outside of my area of expertise. I learn any question that's asked, no matter how bizarre, so stuff I've never even heard of. We'll have 3 people that went through it themselves and at least 1 trained medical expert in it. It blows my mind daily, the level of it. I learn from the people in my group all the time, and I check in there all the time. I've got an Instagram that I post dumb jokes on, so don't bother. And I've got a personal wall, but it's mainly just dumb memes. My Facebook group is really the place to go on my website for articles. So
I'll make sure I get that out there. And then your books are all available off your website as well, aren't they?
Yes, it's stored up, Body Recomposition. There's a link to it. So
people can run those. And then we'll get you back to talk some more.
Absolutely, love to.
Thank you.